Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. We have been looking at the first set of videos where we discuss why we are interested in studying history, and in particular why do we want to study the 1950s. In the previous few videos we looked at how neuroscience as a field spans multiple disciplines, and knowledge and history of neuroscience spans across many species. Knowledge and history of neuroscience also spans across multiple systems and also across many different levels of organization. We also looked at the factors that lead to grand discoveries, not just in neuroscience, but in science in general. What are the factors that lead to grand discoveries or the great leaps? We will be looking at some of the ethical issues in neuroscience, and then we will address the question, why do we want to focus on the studies or the works that were performed in the 1950s. The study of neuroscience includes ethical issues. So, this is somewhat new. Perhaps it was not so prevalent in the 1950s, but it is now a critical component of how research is being carried out, especially in the past 2 or 3 decades, since say for example the year 2000 or so. It is not just enough for you to do good research. The ethical standards with which you conducted this research, the ethical standards with which you performed or conducted this research also matters. As with any other ethical debate, there are many dimensions of this discussion or many axes. It is a truly multidimensional topic. We will try to patiently dissect one by one. The purpose of this discussion is to just give a flavor or a hint about the various possible ethical dilemmas or conundrums. It is not to provide a very detailed discussion about the topic, because such a discussion would be out of scope for a course such as this one, and we are also not discussing all ethical challenges. We are only discussing some of them. I will try to briefly highlight the ones that we are not at all discussing. What do I mean by this when I say ethical challenges? I already mentioned this. It is not just enough to do good research, it is also important to focus on how this research was performed or carried out. Whether this research met high ethical standards in terms of interactions that happen between collaborators, for example, or investigators, for example. These interactions happen in many dimensions. The first and foremost is the discussion or the interaction that happens between a mentor and a student. By definition, there is a power distance between a mentor and a student. Why? Because the mentor usually has a PhD and the student is someone who is seeking to complete a PhD. So, the mentor has something that the student is seeking to do. Almost always the thesis advisor has an extraordinarily large amount of power over the student or the mentee. This power distance can sometimes lead to unpleasant interactions. For example, it is possible that a student could have contributed in a great way towards one particular study or research, but for whatever reason or the reasons better known to the advisor may not give credit to the student in terms of authorship. For example, nowadays there are specific guidelines such as the ICMJE guidelines. On authorship that define how authorship is to be distributed among the various stakeholders, for example. But then whether to adopt such a guideline in a particular lab again is a decision that is made by the mentor or the advisor. So, by definition, the principal investigator or the advisor or the mentor has a tremendous amount of power over the student and can positively and unfortunately sometimes even negatively influence a student's career. This leads to a situation in which the students may be given not so ethical deals sometimes. This is one dimension. There are greater discussions about this elsewhere, but if one wants, they can check out serious research about this topic. We will stop here on this dimension. Then the next dimension recognizes the interactions that happen between a male and a female. In particular, a male senior collaborator, or rather a male advisor and a lady student. So, a junior person, if it is also a lady, if she is working with a much older male, there are two dynamics at play here. One is already there is the power distance between the advisor and the student. On top, there is the male female power distance, that dynamic, that gender dynamic also at play. Sometimes this interaction of these dynamics also could lead to not so ethical interactions that happen between an advisor and a student. So, in particular, this is male mentor and female student. This is another dimension that also happens. Already the contribution that women make in research, are they properly being recognized or acknowledged, is a question that we need to ask ourselves. But on top of that, there is also this dimension that we need to keep in mind. So, when we do research, we need to recognize the existence of this dynamic, that a senior male PI working with a much more junior lady student. In this, there are two dimensions at play. One is the power distance between a student and a mentor, the other is the power distance that exists between a man and a woman. This combination can also lead to a situation in which the women's contribution may not be properly recognized or may lead to other unpleasant interactions, which is not desirable in the professional sphere. The third is the competition between laboratories performing similar research. They frequently discuss that someone is being scooped. You are working on a particular problem and you realize your competitor has already published a paper on the topic. This is called being scooped. If you are working on cutting edge problems and there are only a few ways of solving a problem, it is likely that more than one person or one lab is working on this problem, and it is also likely that sometimes they may scoop you or you may get scooped. While this is normal and daily life, daily business for most of us, what is unacceptable, what is an ethical conundrum in this case is when you get an idea of the problems that are being pursued in the competitive lab using some means that are not readily acceptable, of questionable ethics. You somehow use some shady means to understand the problems that the other person is pursuing, and you pursue the same problems in your lab and publish before the other person. As I am speaking about this, I realize that some of the students are wondering, really scientists do this? Yes, scientists do this because after all scientists are also humans. So, they put their interests sometimes over other people's interests. Like all humans, they come with the baggages that humans come with. So, sometimes this happens. It does not happen always, it is not something that happens often, but let us recognize the existence of this dimension of ethical, questionable ethics that could happen between labs. Competition. Also, let us recognize the distinction between performing research in a single field versus performing research across many fields, because it turns out that shining in more than one field is an extraordinarily difficult proposition. Some labs make such attempts and may not get the recognition that they duly deserve. So, this recognition, this dimension in which single field or multidisciplinary studies are not being given the due recognition or distinction that they properly deserve is sometimes something that we want to keep in mind. This is the other ethical dimension. Then there is the question of race and ethnicity. For example, black researchers, brown researchers, and ethnicity means Jewish researchers. For example, sometimes they are at the receiving end of not direct but some form of indirect racism. I know this is 2024, but this still is prevalent. So, it is important for us to recognize the existence of this dimension. How do you address this problem? Because as someone who has faced this problem, I would like to share a brief anecdote. I will keep it very brief. So, there was this journal that was having a couple of editors in chief who were from UK. I am an Indian and I have brown skin, and these editors are white men from the UK. There are multiple dimensions at play here. On top of the color of the skin, there is also shared history between UK and India, something that we need to keep in mind. They kept on requesting me to review papers for their journal. By the way, it is a journal that I respect and I used to read fully when I was a graduate student. Now I stopped reading it for a different reason. So, I used to review a lot of articles for this journal. At some point, when I submitted my own articles, I was getting desk rejects. The question that came to my mind was, if I was good enough to review articles for your journal, then perhaps I am also good enough to publish in that journal. Many of these things in life are reciprocal, or they work on the basis of reciprocity. You do some work for the journal in the good faith that when you submit, they will be given due consideration. Of course, if the paper is not good, if they are being reviewed and at the end of the review process it is found that the paper is not fit to be published in the journal, it makes sense for the paper to be rejected, which by the way I am happy to accept as one of the possible results. But if it is given desk rejects, then you are questioning, so I am good enough to be a reviewer but not good enough to be an author. There comes a point when you decide that you will no longer review articles for this journal. So, you blacklist these journals. But how do you face this? I mean, other than blacklisting this journal, how do you face this? It's very critical that you stand up and speak up. Never bow down. Stand up, always speak up, and do fantastic high quality work. Never bow down. Not to any of this. This is true for students. This is true for the power dynamic between male and female. This is true when there is this competition that exists between laboratories. This is true when recognition is not given for truly multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work. This is true everywhere. When you feel that you are at the receiving end of such ethical problems, stand up and speak up. Always be heard, and when you present your arguments, be calm and present your arguments with absolute conviction. There is no need for us to be emotional about this. If your points are convincing, there is no need for you to raise your voice. You can speak up, but there is no need to yell at that. It is critical to be calm and make convincing points. So, you need to keep doing this. These are things, these are the glass ceilings that we need to break. The 21st century, we are still facing these problems. It's a shame. These are glass ceilings. These are the ceilings that we want to keep on breaking. We need to keep working on that. Then the problem of political intrusion and coercion, for example, of the kind faced by Jewish scientists in Nazi Germany. So, the kind of science that they do was defined by who is ruling or who is performing the science. This led to a situation in which a lot of Jewish scientists, or it led to an exodus of Jewish scientists from Nazi Germany. Then the problem of nationalities and language. USA, being the technology powerhouse that it is, and the superpower that it is, has come to dominate research performed in certain fields, and English has come to be the language of science. A question is it necessarily true that research performed or coming out of the United States is necessarily superior, or research that is written in English is necessarily superior? So, whenever you speak of scientific writing, you are speaking about writing in the English language, technical writing in the English language. No one speaks about how to present your science in Hindi or Mandarin, Chinese, for example. No one speaks about that. No one speaks about how to present your research in Brazilian Portuguese. Whenever we speak about scientific writing, we speak about scientific writing using technical English. Right? So, English has come to be the language of science. Does that necessarily mean that any science that is written in English is superior? There is no answer to this question. My only point is that this is something that we need to keep in our mind. So far, we have seen the ethical challenges between two parties, for example, between a mentor and a student, between a senior male and a junior female, competition that can happen between laboratories, discrimination that can happen based on race and ethnicity, political coercion and intrusion, nationalities and language. What we have not spoken about are the topics of animal ethics. Is it ethical to use animal models in our studies? I mean, we like to think that it is ethical. As a neuroscientist, I am trying to say yes, it is ethical because a tremendous amount of knowledge has been built by performing animal studies, animal models, and human health has been greatly improved by performing studies and model systems that are animals. But the question continues to exist about ethics of animal research, ethics of human research. When I say animal ethics, what I mean is that animal research ethics, human research ethics. So, these are topics that I have not even started speaking about. These are all topics that one should keep in mind as one is performing research in any field, but in particular neuroscience. Now, we move on to why do we want to study the 1950s. The 1950s can be considered as the golden age or the golden decade of neuroscience, but not just neuroscience, but also biology in general. Is that true? What's special about the 1950s? Well, if one were to say a single discovery in the field of biology, you can look at DNA structure, for example. The discovery of the DNA structure alone is enough to make the claim that the 1950s was indeed the golden decade for the field of biology. If one were to make a similar table, a table similar to the one that we are now seeing for other decades, you will likely not see such density, such a high number of discoveries being made in a single decade, nor will they have that high quality, right. So, there was an explosion of creative activity in the field of neuroscience, science in general, neuroscience in particular. Remember, for example, this all started with the development of the intracellular electrode, which later was used to describe phenomena such as action potentials, for example. But then the instrumentation required were also available in the late 1940s. By the way, it is important to recognize that the people who worked in the 1940s and 1950s essentially built their work from the works of the doyens who preceded them. For example, at the end of the 19th century, whatever was the research that was done, people have built on that. People have stood on the shoulders of giants, but there are also other developments. The historical developments such as the war or war necessitated developments in technology also helped research. Some studies such as the one on homunculus or the little man in the brain were performed in the 1930s. By the way of questionable ethics, we will discuss that when we discuss that topic. But remember, our ethical standard today was not existent in the 1930s, 90 years ago. So, we cannot apply the ethical standards of today to a study that was performed in the 1930s. By the same token, we also cannot use that as the excuse to perform research at the same level of ethics that was performed in the 1930s. Both are not acceptable. Just because we have a different ethical standards, not necessarily higher, we cannot claim moral superiority over the research that was done in the 1930s. It was just a different time, something to keep in mind. Some of that research was performed in the 1930s, the homunculus research, the little man of some significance. We will discuss that as we go along. But then in the 1950s is when serious research started picking up. For example, this, the description of action potential, spinal pathways, dendritic potentials in the 1953. Yes, importantly, that landmark work by Hodgkin and Huxley. Then studies on the reward system, Renshaw inhibition. Right. The idea that information was communicated in quanta, right. That. Then active dendrites, for example. Right. Then the idea that brain functions as a computer, for example. And importantly, the discovery of dopamine, DOPA for PD, for example. I am only pointing out some studies and some discoveries. And this idea that dendrites had branches and neuron doctrine of the 1890s or the late 19th century itself was being revised. So, these are some of the discoveries that happened in the 1950s that makes the 1950s the golden decade because of this explosion of creative activity, because of this explosion of a great number of high quality studies performed in the field of neuroscience in particular, science and technology in general. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we looked at some of the ethical issues that faces neuroscience between mentor and a mentee, between a male and a female, competition that exists between labs, the challenges of race and ethnicity, political intrusion and coercion, and nationality and language, and the ethics of performing animal research and human research, and whether ethics and whether such studies are being performed with the highest ethical standards after approval by appropriate committees, etc., are questions. Then we discussed about why should we focus on the decade that was 1950s, because it was not just the golden decade for neuroscience, but also the golden decade for biology in general. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you very much for your attention.